Robots. I like them. You got your little boys, and you got your big fellas, and you got your futuristic fops, and they're all neat, except for these guys.
Don't use no self-service machines, 'cause you gon' pay me.
But robots peaked with Transformers, and you'd be hard-pressed to convince me or anyone else on planet Earth otherwise. So it only stands to reason that a robot that's sleek and also huge and also a Transformer would be the be-all end-all. And that's why Monster Rancher rocks. Because today we're talking about Henger, a fine-tuned murder robot who is also a floating dog. People are often surprised with just how massive Henger is. What really hits home though is how much taller he is than Durahan, a suit of armor the size of a normal human. Or a normal human mother. With the release of Ultra Kaiju Monster Rancher looming around the corner, I gave my Patreons a choice between Henger and Zilla, since I felt it fitting to talk about one of the biggest boys on the roster. If you're a little bit perturbed that a literal whale isn't the one being featured in the Big Mode edition of Rancher Rundown, then, well, you can always join the Patreon. But for this month, we're talking about the monster canonically most likely to drop 80 in the NBA Finals. Or like 200 in Slam Ball. We just talk about Slam Ball in every video now, I guess. That's what this channel has become. Henger has a pretty interesting niche in Monster Rancher and a fairly unique personality when it comes to the canon of robots in general. While his on-ranch mannerisms depict a playful nature, he's quite literally built first and foremost for combat. Despite his size, Henger has an evasive fighting style and can't take hits very easily. A mix of good power and intelligence gains with the text to match allow for flexibility in your build, but his lackluster guts regeneration means you need to pick your spots carefully to capitalize in battle. Henger has a ton of attacks with good accuracy, but they're offset by a high average guts cost, and he ends up needing to roll the dice more often than not. Like most slow guts rate monsters, Henger's basics are actually pretty good. Punch is one of the better 10 cost techs. Above average accuracy and damage makes it a really solid choice for chip damage. There's not much to talk about here, it's just a good move. Low kick has the rare trait of being a basic tech with a bit of sharpness. Coupled with a bit more damage and accuracy than punch, this ends up being one of the most cost-effective and consistent sources of damage in the entire game, especially when rolled down multiple times with a high guts reserve. Both of Henger's basics are general purpose techs that don't often find themselves being techs you wish he wouldn't swing. Both of them being in slot 1 isn't that big of a deal, though it does mean you don't get to decide which one he uses. But slot 1's about to get a lot more crowded, so there's no point worrying about it yet. Heavy Chop is a logical progression from Punch. Verging on being a heavy tech with a bit of withering, this move is still pretty accurate and well above the value its 15 guts cost would imply. While it's not a necessary pickup on every single Henger build, it often has game-changing potential and can be spammed pretty easily, so most people get it. Low Kick has a tech chain as well, and it too is in slot 1. Kick and Heavy Chop are actually very similar, and lots of players pick up both because you might as well. Kick trades a bit of accuracy for marginally more burst potential through sharpness, but everything I said about Heavy Chop also applies here. Fantastic animation times, consistency, and spammability make Henger a terrifying infighter in all matchups. Henger is in the running for the strongest monster in the game when up close and personal. He may not have a true nuke in slot 1, but this extremely high level of reliable and often game-winning damage output is very rare in Monster Rancher 2. Hammerfall is a low-cost heavy tech that works well in conjunction with his basics. At 27 force, this tech isn't particularly powerful for a heavy, but it's kept in tune by having a low cost and a manageable hit percent. This tech really shines versus tanks where it can be used continuously for huge chunks of damage, but it's also a fairly risk-averse way to crush a glass cannon. Sledgefall chains from Hammerfall, and it's mostly more of the same. Bigger damage with a longer animation time makes this a great finisher, but it can be especially bad for Henger if it hits early and doesn't KO. Like its predecessor, this move is very strong in tank-centric metagames like 2997 where running speed is often a liability, but its usefulness drops off considerably when monsters are able to fully invest in speed. Laser Cutter is another heavy tech, significantly harder hitting than Sledgefall, but it is wildly inaccurate. If you like to gamble, I'll tell you that's your tech. You win some, you lose some, it's all the same to me. Two cutters though, I suppose is like a gamble by definition, but it's like guessing right on the roulette table and making an extra $1 over your initial bet. It's nearly double the cost of its prerequisite and has almost nothing to show for it. This is an atrociously bad tech. It doesn't even work in tank matchups because you would always just prefer Henger use Laser Cutter twice. But he does a backflip, so that's pretty sick. Pick up this move if you're a fan of backflips or watching your monster lose. Yo-Yo is Henger's weakest power tech, and that's because it's all about draining guts. 24 guts down on average for 17 costs may seem really good at first glance, but the huge windup in Henger's below average guts regen makes it kinda hard to use effectively. 2 yo-yos doubles the damage, so it ends up being a bit more generally usable. The withering ratio isn't as good as it is on the single yo-yo, but the ability to rip 37 guts away from your opponent is pretty big. 29 cost on Henger is expensive though. So while this isn't a particularly inaccurate tech at -5, it becomes a gamble, especially given the lost opportunity cost of not just swinging his slot 1 techs instead. Henger's most iconic move is Fist Missile, and there's a good reason for it. While technically a sharp tech, this move bucks the trend in a big way, boasting high accuracy and a genuine, honest-to-god affordable cost. This is also Henger's quickest attack and can serve as a powerful opening. While it's arguably Henger's most cost-efficient and overall best tech, Fist Missile is actually not a guaranteed pickup. Going first with Henger has its disadvantages, as its bad guts regen means that on a retaliatory hit, he may lose too many guts after spending the 19 for Fist Missile to actually get back into the game. Drill Shot, however, is more of a classic sharp tech, and by that I mean it does a bit of everything but doesn't do much of anything. Significantly more expensive and significantly less accurate for a bit more damage and withering isn't really the trade-off Henger wants on a round opening tech. Drill Shot begs you to run a bad-natured monster to maximize your chances to crit, as without a proc it struggles to be worth the cost. Drill Shots, with an S, is the last tech in the chain, and it's pretty explosive for a round opener. With a 50% chance to crit, this tech ends up being a Gelcopter analog half the time. Pretty accurate for the cost and how the rest of the tech is lined up, Drill Shots works well to win games on frame 1, as long as you're willing to risk it all. Laser Sword is like a slightly more risk-averse death final. Only -5 hit means you'll usually be sitting around a 50-50 shot given his guts correction tier, but missing Laser Sword is often enough to immediately lose the match. Extremely risky given the consequences, but the high withering does a lot to keep momentum in Henger's favor even if this doesn't outright nuke his opponent from the map. Laser Swords, again with an S, is Henger's most expensive and most powerful tech. It gets a substantial boost to damage and sharpness over Laser Sword that probably isn't actually necessary, with the dramatic downside of being much less accurate and one of the very few techs in the game that cost more than 50 guts. When Laser Swords is used, the game is often immediately won, or who depends on if it hits or not. Henger has far fewer intelligence techs, and they're not nearly as varied as his power options. Since he has no way to cover up his basics, his intelligence techs are rarely seen in competitive play, but they're honestly not terrible. Except for Soundwave. Soundwave is a withering tech with low force on a slow guts rate monster. The only real use case for this tech is to dictate the pace of a match on frame 1 versus other slow guts rate monsters. If you're running a build that can't really take a hit, this can be good for mitigating incoming damage early, but a better way to mitigate damage early is just to secure the KO instead. This is one of those techs that has strategic value in play with human control, but it's a consistent liability in AI versus AI. Arm Cannon has good damage and accuracy for 18 guts, though it really misses out on the burst potential of stuff like Fist Missile or Kick, in exchange for even more consistency. Unfortunately, this tech doesn't end up being as impactful as you'd hope, but it does have its uses and it really shines versus monsters with high speed. Napalm Shot ups the damage and cost in a considerable way over Arm Cannon. 24 guts is an investment on Henger, but Napalm Shot ends up being one of his best options on the intelligence side. The boosted sharpness is nice as well and means that about 30% of the time you have a B-Force tech with plus 15 hit for just 24 guts. Not necessarily a scenario you can consistently rely on, but it's always nice when it happens. Burst Cannon is Henger's biggest option for damage on the intelligence side, so in that respect it's a bit underwhelming. About as strong as when Napalm Shot procs a crit, Burst Cannon is not unusable by any means, but the additional 11 cost is pretty hefty. Plus 10 hit is nice and the additional withering helps too, but Burst Cannon is best used as the last tech Henger fires off in a match, or as a counterattack after a high guts miss from the opponent, as its consistency tends to falter a bit if Henger needs to spend time building up his guts again afterwards to get back into the match. And that's where I would normally end, but Henger actually has a second tech chain split from Punch, and it's so batshit that I had no idea how to segue to it properly, so I'm just gonna throw it in at the end. The other tech that chains from Punch is I-Beam. I-Beam is more or less an intelligence version of Drill Shot. It's not nearly as bad as some of the other sharp techs we've seen so far in the series, but it probably needs a bit more withering or hit percent to really hit its value mark. Henger has a pretty wide variety of tech loadouts and has the ability to mix and match techs better than most monsters. Depending on the stat cap, your choices with Henger can vary drastically, so let's take a look at a few builds and Henger's goals in each of them. In the 3500 heavyweight meta, Fist Missile and Laser Cutter complement each other as anti-speed and anti-tank options respectively. Cutter can be risky, but this build has a lot of trouble with tanks without it. You can get Hammerfall and Sledgefall instead if you're willing to trade damage for better accuracy, but either way I usually end up leaving at least one slot open to allow him the opportunity to build up some more guts. I'd normally pick up both Kick and Heavy Chop in this format as they're solid, consistent damage and help patch up his issues with Cutter versus speed monsters. You can run Drill Shots for the chance to frame 1 speed monsters, but I find it's often not worth the cost. Conversely, in the 2997 middleweight meta, attacking frame 1 with Henger is usually just a straight up bad call. Tanks are more prevalent in this meta and Fist Missile just does not do nearly enough damage to really be worth it most of the time. It can be good versus gimmicky anti-tank builds like Cyclone Golem that run extremely low life and defense, but it's a matchup dependent type of tech. Hammerfall and Sledgefall along with the basics makes up for a consistent, low risk build. Laser Cutter can be used here, but 2997 is a meta rife with counter builds and it really just comes down to who you think your opponents are going to be. In the 1400 lightweight mixed attacker format, Henger can take advantage of his intelligence attacks in a way that he usually can't otherwise. And with lightweight being the most tank heavy meta in rotation at the moment, the high accuracy on these techs allow him to run low skill builds that would otherwise be non-viable. reliable, so he can spend more points patching up his defenses. Laser Cutter also works extremely well in this meta, but often can't be used properly in conjunction with the low skill build. So your options are to run Napalm Shot and Burst Cannon, or run Laser Cutter, but not both. One time I tried to convince the kid behind the counter at the bubble tea place to make me a lemon smoothie, and I could see the gears churning in his head as he tried to figure out how to add lemon to milk without making it curdle. These texts together are like that lemon smoothie, and the kid was right to look at me like I was an idiot. Henger has a lot of cool subbreeds, and we see a lot of them in competitive play solely because of how sick nasty they are. Which is great because strictly speaking, Huey the Metal Nurse subtype single-handedly keeps the breed above water. A monster with Henger's tech choices could never be truly bad, but he tends to languish a bit as a kind of a lesser version of other monsters that exist unless you're running Huey. He sits in a tier much higher than the bulk of the cast, but he can really struggle versus the strongest monsters in the game. Henger has higher than average sharpness, meaning you can focus on shoring up his damage output by focusing on maximizing critical hit chance through the bad-natured stress bonus. Huey can benefit from Henger, but most Henger builds want to avoid this unless they're running a tank build. Henger's incidental withering is fine, but Henger doesn't do a ton to make it a functional playstyle. You can always run power and hope for late game comebacks, but it comes at the cost of lower critical chances. Henger in the Monster Rancher lore is old tech from before God sealed all the monsters away, used by humans to wage war in a variety of ways, which holds true for his playstyle in Monster Rancher 2. You've got as many options to play Henger as he's got gizmos. Some are a bit rustier than others, but they're all mostly functional. He's a really fun monster that allows for player expression in a way that some others don't. He lets you take on as much or as little risk as you want without ending up in gimmick territory, and I can't think of a monster better suited for that transformative ability. So thank you guys for watching another one of these. Like I said off the top, this was voted on by my Patreons. If you want to help out, you want to support the channel, Patreon's a great way to do that. You get sneak peeks of videos before they go live, you get to vote on what's coming up next, all that kind of fun stuff. Over the next few weeks and ramping up to Ultra Kaiju Monster Rancher, we are running a ton of tournaments on twitch.tv/moosebones. Every Monday and Wednesday at 8 PM Eastern until Kaiju releases, we'll be hosting the finals for the DXBL Season 2. And once Ultra Kaiju releases, we will be doing a week of streams starting on the 20th, finishing on the 27th with another blindfolded marathon stream. So I hope you guys are excited for that and, tune in. I'll see you there.